The radio operator at the Southern Command Post in Avdiivka noted the time in his log at 03:14 on the morning of February 14th, and what he wrote next was not a report of incoming fire. It was a report of incoming silence. For the first time in 81 hours, the Russian artillery had stopped. No outgoing shells, no counter-battery exchanges, no harassment fire on the supply roads. Nothing. The operator marked the silence and then sat back from his console because every soldier in that position understood what silence meant after 3.5 days of continuous bombardment. Silence was not relief. Silence was the inhale before the final breath. And the Ukrainian commander reading that log entry knew, with a clarity that arrived too late to act on, that the defense of his sector had already been decided. He simply did not yet know the shape the decision would take. This is not a story about an artillery barrage. This is a story about what happens when a defensive system, designed and built around assumptions that were once correct, encounters a tempo of pressure those assumptions were never engineered to absorb. I have spent decades studying how positions hold and how positions fail, and the most important thing I can tell you about Avdiivka is that the collapse was not caused by the final assault. The collapse was caused by what happened in the 72 hours before the final assault, when the defense was still intact on the map, but no longer intact in the minds and bodies of the men holding it. By the time the Russian infantry moved forward, they were not breaching a defensive line. They were walking into a position that had already surrendered every quality that made it defensible, except its geography. And geography alone has never held a battlefield. Let me start with the assumption, because every catastrophic defeat has one, and the one at Avdiivka was not foolish. It was, in its original context, sound military logic. The Ukrainian defensive architecture in that sector had been constructed and refined over nearly a decade. Concrete reinforcement, layered trench systems, hardened command nodes, prepared fallback positions, pre-registered fire zones. The doctrine governing that defense assumed that any Russian offensive would follow a recognizable rhythm. Bombardment, then probing assault, then pause to assess, then committed assault. Within that rhythm, defenders would rotate, resupply, evacuate wounded, repair damaged positions, and reset their readiness between phases. The system was not built to be invulnerable. It was built to be resilient across cycles. Hit it, give it time, hit it again, and each cycle would degrade it gradually while reinforcements arrived to maintain coherence. That logic had worked in this sector for years. It had worked against Russian assaults in 2022. It had worked against renewed pressure in 2023. There was no reason from inside the system to believe it would not work again. The reason it would not work again is that Russia had stopped fighting in cycles. Somewhere in the operational planning for this offensive, a decision had been made that the rhythm itself was the target. Not the trenches, not the bunkers, not the men inside them. The rhythm. If the defense was built around the assumption of pauses, then the elimination of pauses was the lever that would unmake the defense. And that is precisely what 96 continuous hours of bombardment was designed to do. Russia was not trying to destroy the position with shells. Russia was using shells to deny the defenders the one resource their entire defensive philosophy depended on: time between blows. The conditions closing around the Ukrainian defenders in those first 24 hours were not what the casualty reports would later capture. The reports would speak of damaged emplacements, expended ammunition, wounded personnel, evacuated under fire. Those numbers are real, but they are the visible portion of a much deeper problem. What was actually happening inside those positions during the first day was the slow, grinding erosion of the human systems that make a defense function. Men cannot be rotated when the supply roads are under continuous interdiction. Wounded cannot be properly evacuated when every movement above ground is observed and engaged. Sleep cannot be taken in 20-minute increments without degrading the cognitive function required to operate complex weapons, coordinate fires, and make defensive decisions under pressure. The position was not running out of ammunition in the first day. It was running out of something more fundamental. It was running out of the capacity to think clearly about what it was doing. This is where I need you to understand something about modern defensive operations that civilian commentary almost always misses. A defensive position derives its combat power from two qualities working in concert: endurance and refresh. Endurance is what allows a position to absorb damage without losing its structural integrity. Refresh is what allows that endurance to be replenished across time. Remove either one, and the other becomes a depleting asset rather than a sustainable one. A position with infinite endurance and no refresh will eventually be ground down to nothing. A position with rapid refresh and no endurance will be overrun before it can recover. Avdiivka had been built with extraordinary endurance and a refresh cycle that depended on operational pauses to function. When the pauses were eliminated, the endurance began to convert, in real time, from a strength into a countdown. Every hour that passed without refresh was an hour subtracted from a total that could not be replenished. The defenders still had concrete. They still had weapons. They still had courage. What they no longer had was a clock that would ever reset. And while this was happening inside the position, something else was happening outside it that I want to draw your attention to, because it represents a level of operational discipline that deserves to be named accurately. Russia was not simply firing artillery for 96 hours. Russia was managing a campaign of pressure with internal sophistication that the volume of fire concealed. Different battery groups were assigned different temporal patterns. Some fired in sustained barrages. Others fired in irregular, unpredictable bursts. Some targeted the frontline positions. Others targeted the rear areas, the command nodes, the suspected rotation points, the approach roads that reinforcements would have to use. The combination produced an environment in which no part of the Ukrainian defensive depth was operating outside the threat envelope. There was no quiet zone where men could rest. There was no rear area where coordination could happen without interruption. The bombardment was not a barrage in the historical sense of that word. It was a saturation of the entire operational space the defense required in order to function. The patience this required on the Russian side is worth examining, because in this kind of operation, the temptation to commit infantry early is enormous. Commanders watch a position absorb hour after hour of fire, and they begin to believe it must already be broken. They want to send their assault troops forward to confirm what the bombardment has accomplished. The Russian commander at Avdiivka did not yield to that temptation. He held his infantry. He let the shells do their work. He understood that the moment of maximum opportunity was not when the position first showed signs of degradation. The moment of maximum opportunity was when the position had lost the ability to coordinate a coherent defensive response. And that moment could not be rushed. It had to be allowed to arrive. By the 72nd hour, the indicators that would have told the Russian command that the moment was approaching were accumulating. Ukrainian radio traffic had degraded in both volume and clarity. Counter-battery fire from the defending side had become sporadic and reactive rather than predictive. Drone operations from the Ukrainian sector had thinned noticeably, suggesting that drone teams were either casualties, displaced, or operating without the support architecture they normally relied on. Most tellingly, the resupply attempts along the southern approach roads had become smaller and less frequent, indicating that the logistics chain feeding the position was itself under enough pressure that it could no longer maintain its normal tempo. These were not signs that the position was about to fall. These were signs that the position had already begun to convert from a defensive system into a collection of isolated strongpoints, each one fighting its own war with whatever resources it had inside its own walls. This is the moment I want you to fix in your mind, because it is the doctrinal pivot that everything else turns on. A position does not fail when its outer perimeter is breached. A position fails when the integrated relationships between its components break down. The trenches at Avdiivka were still occupied at hour 72. The bunkers were still standing. The men inside them were still alive and still armed. But the position, as a system, was no longer functioning. The command nodes could no longer effectively direct the strongpoints. The strongpoints could no longer effectively support each other. The artillery could no longer effectively suppress the threats developing in front of its assigned sectors. Each component was still present on the map. None of them were still operating together. And a defensive system that cannot operate together is not a defense. It is a series of individual last stands waiting to happen in sequence. Then came the silence at Oro 3:14 on the morning of the fourth day, and the silence was the signal, not because the Russians had run out of shells, because the Russians had assessed that the position had reached the condition they had spent 96 hours preparing it to reach. The bombardment ended because the bombardment had finished its work. What came next was not an assault against a defense. It was an occupation of a space where a defense had previously existed. The Ukrainian response in those final hours before the ground assault was, I want to be clear about this, tactically competent under the circumstances. Reserve units were activated. Drone teams were repositioned to cover the most likely axes of advance. Counter-battery assets that had survived the bombardment were prepared to engage the assembly areas the Russian infantry would have to use. There was no panic. There was no surrender. The men holding the position understood what was coming and prepared to meet it with what they had left. And what they had left, by every honest measure, was still substantial in terms of equipment and personnel. The problem was that none of what they had left was integrated anymore. The drone teams could not communicate effectively with the artillery. The artillery could not effectively support the frontline positions. The frontline positions could not effectively warn each other of breakthroughs developing in adjacent sectors. The defense had become a museum of its former self, every artifact still in place, none of the connections between them intact. The Russian assault that morning advanced along three axes simultaneously, and this is where the cruelty of the geometry the defenders were facing becomes clear. To hold the front-line trenches under direct assault required concentrating fire forward, which exposed the flanks. To shift forces to cover the flanks required thinning the front, which invited breakthrough. To pull back to the prepared fallback positions required movement above ground through an environment where drone coverage and observed fire had not diminished simply because the long-range artillery had paused. Every option available to the defenders required the position to function as an integrated system, and the position was no longer capable of functioning as an integrated system. The defenders were not being asked to fight harder. They were being asked to perform a kind of coordination that the previous 96 hours had specifically destroyed their capacity to perform. The breakthrough, when it came, did not happen at the strongest point of the Russian effort. It happened at a seam between two Ukrainian companies whose communication had degraded to the point that neither one knew in real time what the other was doing. A Russian assault group identified the seam by direct observation, exploited it within 20 minutes of first contact, and turned the flank of the eastern strongpoint before any reserve could be coordinated to seal the gap. Within 2 hours of the seam being breached, 3 additional positions had been bypassed and isolated. By mid-afternoon, the southern command post that had logged the silence at Oro 3:14 was itself under direct attack from a direction the defensive plan had never anticipated, because the defensive plan had assumed an integrated defense that could prevent that direction from becoming accessible. And here is the lesson I want every serious student of modern warfare to take from Avdiivka, because the lesson is not about artillery, and it is not about Russian numerical advantage, and it is not about Western aid shortfalls, although all of those factors are real. The lesson is about what kind of pressure modern defensive systems must now be designed to withstand. The old assumption, the one that built the defense at Avdiivka and built defenses like it across every army I have ever worked with, was that pressure arrives in cycles and that the gaps between cycles are when defenses recover. That assumption was correct for most of the 20th century. It is no longer correct now. An adversary with sufficient artillery, sufficient drones, sufficient electronic warfare capability, and sufficient operational discipline can eliminate the cycle entirely. They can produce a continuous pressure environment in which the defender never enters a refresh phase. And against that kind of pressure, a defensive system built on cycle-dependent refresh is not a defensive system. It is a timer. What this means for every army that may face this kind of warfare in the years ahead is uncomfortable to articulate but necessary to confront. Defensive depth alone is no longer sufficient. Concrete alone is no longer sufficient. Heroism alone is no longer sufficient. What is required is defensive architecture that can refresh itself under continuous pressure rather than between pulses of pressure. That means rotation schemes that do not depend on operational pauses. It means logistics chains that can deliver under sustained interdiction rather than during quiet windows. It means command structures that can preserve coherence even when their normal communications environment has been saturated for days at a time. And it means accepting at the doctrinal level that the most dangerous moment in a modern defense is not the moment of assault. The most dangerous moment is the moment, somewhere in the long approach to assault, when the defense quietly loses the ability to refresh itself and continues to occupy positions it can no longer truly defend. Avdiivka fell because the men holding it were brave, and bravery was not the variable that mattered. They fell because the defense they had inherited was built for a kind of war that the war they were actually fighting had already moved beyond. The position is gone now. The maps have been redrawn. But the questions that position raises are the questions every military planner reading current intelligence reports should be losing sleep over. How many of our own defensive concepts still assume the cyclical pressure environment that Avdiivka assumed? How many of our refresh schemes still depend on pauses that a competent adversary will simply refuse to grant us? And when the next continuous pressure campaign begins somewhere on this continent or another, how many hours will it take before the silence arrives? And how many of our commanders will recognize what the silence means before it is already too late?